Hi, welcome to EC&M Tech Talks. This is a series of how-to videos where we'll cover everything from basic electrical theory at times on into the equipment, devices, and so forth that we install out in the field, right onto the codes and standards that tell us how not only to install that equipment, but how to maintain it as well. So anyway, I'm your host, Randy Barnett. This Tech Talk video is brought to you by EC&M Magazine. And if you haven't already, like if you're watching this on YouTube, what you want to do is go to ecmweb.com, and then in the upper left-hand corner, there's a drop-down menu. Go ahead and click on that, and the very first item will be premium content. And if you haven't, go ahead and sign up for that premium content. And the reason is it's free, and when you watch this on the ecmweb.com, you'll find lots of related articles and videos, maybe webinars, whatever, related to this content, as well as tons of other information regarding the electrical construction and maintenance world. So anyway, let's get started and figure out what we're going to talk about today. Well, let's say if we were walking through your plant or your facility or whatever, and you said, hey, what's that thing on the wall back there? And I'd say, oh, well, that's looks like some kind of disconnect switch, I guess. And we use them, like to shut power off and on to a motor. And there's probably a motor around here somewhere, because you're supposed to be able to go stand by the motor and see that switch. Well, that's a pretty lame explanation for what's really going on. Because in the real world, if we were to go to the National Electrical Code and look up something like disconnect switch, we wouldn't find it. That's not a disconnect switch. Let's take a look at it. So here's what we've got. It says right here in front, it says safety switch. Okay, so it's a safety switch. It's a heavy duty safety switch, in fact, in what it says. And we know that if we open it up on the inside, we're going to see some knife blades up here and some stabs, which we can operate with the handle over here. And then we've got 3 cartridge type fuses. So there are some requirements for this safety switch, but let's talk a little bit about it. First of all, let's see if we can find a definition then. Since we don't find a definition for disconnect switch in Article 100 of the NEC, let's see if we can find maybe a definition for safety switch. We don't. There's no definition for safety switch in the National Electrical Code. So what do? Well, the NFPA style manual says that, hey, if you have a word and you need to define it, and it's not defined in the code or standard, then you go to the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, the 11th edition, okay, and look up your word, see what it is. So I did pull up safety switch, knowing we weren't going to find it. It says, according to the dictionary, a safety switch is an electric switch completely enclosed in a metal box. Got that covered, with an external control handle, and so designed that the box cannot be opened while the switch is closed, and the switch cannot be closed when the box is open. Well, that's true. If I try and operate the handle right now, there's an interlock down here, right? That prevents that from happening. And the same way, I can go ahead and close the switch, and then I can go ahead, close the door, and then I can go ahead and operate the switch, but I can't open the door now with that switch in the on position. I've got an interlock over here on the side that I would have to turn and override in order to get that to work. So it meets the definition of a safety switch. But what do we use this switch for? We use this switch, to turn off power, say, to a motor or another piece of equipment. So we use it as a disconnecting means. And there is a definition in Article 100 for disconnecting means. So let's go look at that in Article 100 for disconnecting means. A device or a group of devices or other means by which the conductors of a circuit can be disconnected from the source of supply. So obviously, this safety switch can serve as a disconnecting means, but we have other disconnecting means as well, don't we? How about as simple as a attachment plug that I plug into a receptacle? I unplug it, I've disconnected the power to my piece of equipment. In fact, there's a requirement. We see applications for that in the code. In fact, there's a requirement in Article 440 for single phase room air conditioners. And it says that I can use that attachment plug to plug into as the disconnect, as long as the manual controls are no more than 6 feet above the floor for that air conditioning unit. Well, the very next section then tells you that the length of the power cord for that air conditioning unit can't be more than 6 feet anyway. So you're okay then, huh? So I have a disconnecting means. Yes, it's in an enclosure, safety switch, and a metal enclosure. There are different types of enclosures. This is a type 1 enclosure. It's good for pretty much falling dust indoors, and that's about it, really. Falling dirt, whatever. We can go to 110.28 though if we want to select another type of enclosure. So 110.28, let's take a quick look at that. Table 110.28 enclosure selection. So it's divided up into two categories. There's for outdoor enclosures and indoor. So if we look at the indoor, we find that a type 1, they all prevent incidental contact, right? These enclosures, so that we don't accidentally touch something we shouldn't. Other than that, it's good for falling dirt. And that's about it for a type 1. Also, I'll mention, let's go ahead and talk about this as far as all of your kind of a general rule for all of your disconnecting means, whether it's this, a molded case circuit breaker, whatever it is. Section 110.29 is a new section, and it was placed there not because it's changing any information, but just in order to conform with the requirements for how they write the codes and standards. And I called our style manual for the NFPA. Anyway, it says 110.29. It talks about in sight from, within sight from, or within sight. Same definition we find in 110.29. That's also in Article 100 on definitions. And what it talks about, well, the general rule, I got to be able to see it, and it can't be more than 50 feet away. That's what we talk about when we say something's got to be in sight from. And that's what it's talking about in 110.29. Okay, so be aware of that one, and be aware of that general rule on disconnects. But we're going to find our exceptions to that as well as we take a look and go through this. Now, I can use other things as disconnecting means, right? For instance, I can go inside of my panel board. And of course, I've got a main breaker up here at the top. That's my disconnecting means. I've got requirements. For instance, if I'm using, I've got two breakers here, if you can see it, but two separate molded case breakers that I can supply a duplex receptacle, right? Break that little tab off on the hot side of that duplex receptacle, separating the bottom receptacle from the top, and or I guess the top from the bottom, huh? What I've got is a multi-wire branch circuit then. Now, the thing is that, so if I connect the red wire to the top half and the black to the bottom half of that receptacle, or duplex, whatever, I could de-energize one and not the other one. So as a disconnecting means, that could be very unsafe. So if I were just to shut off the one circuit breaker, go in there and pull the receptacle out of the box to work on something, I would still have one ungrounded conductor coming into it. And of course, that could be bad news for me. So I'm required to tie those handles together. I've got to tie them together. And in Article 240, it says I have to use identified handle ties. Now, I actually have one over here on the right. It's pretty hard for you to see from that distance, but it is two separate molded case breakers tied together with an identified handle tie then. So we can certainly use our molded case breakers very often used for disconnecting means, and different types of switches and so on. One more thing that I can use for disconnecting means, and you'll see this quite a bit. This is a instantaneous trip circuit breaker. So the handle's right here in the middle. Turn it right side up for you. And so the handle's right here in the middle. Got some information over here. Let's see what it says. It says it's magnetic only trip setting in amperes. So it's magnetic. So the breakers behind me up here are thermomagnetic breakers, right? The magnetic gives me short circuit and ground fault protection. The thermal portion of the breaker gives me overload protection. No overload protection on this breaker. So by definition in Article 240, this becomes a motor circuit protector. It's actually an informational note in Article 240. So if it provides instantaneous trips only, magnetic trips only, and if it is adjustable, and I can adjust the magnetic trips, actually it's right here, it gives me a value. So it says 3 amps up here. So you'd say, well, it's a 3 amp breaker. Yeah, but I can adjust it from 8 times 3 amp to 28 times 3 for my instantaneous trip settings in. And so this can be used, this motor circuit protector is often used inside, where this one actually came from, is the inside of a motor control center. So if I take an entire unit and get it listed, I have my motor circuit protector, and then I feed from there into my motor controller. I've got a pretty good setup now because I've got ground fault and short circuit protection with my motor circuit protector, instantaneous circuit breaker. I have overload protection right down here at the bottom with the overload portion of my controller, the overload relay, in this case, some bimetallic thermal devices then. Now, if we want to find out, well, how do we apply these disconnecting means? I mean, where do we use them? Where do we need them? What are the rules? Is there some section here that just tells me, here's all the rules for your disconnecting means? And the answer is no. I go back to the index and I take a look, I find disconnecting means. So once again, if you're in the 2023 NEC, that's page 876. And I find disconnecting means. And if you take the time to count them up, there are just over 70 different applications of disconnecting means in the National Electrical Code, meaning that there are 70 different areas, 70 different sections and subsections and so forth, where the term disconnecting means appears and applies. So for instance, it starts with agricultural buildings. Some of the more important things might be things like air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, refrigerating equipment. In fact, 440 Part 2 gives me the information on disconnecting means for air conditioning and refrigerating equipment. So here we are, Article 440, air conditioning and refrigerating equipment. Part 2 is on the disconnecting means. And the bottom line is that I want to make sure that this disconnect, this one disconnect then, when I shut the power off to that air conditioning and refrigerating equipment, is that I de-energize not only the motor compressor itself, but also I de-energize the control circuits. And always read your rules, right? You're going to find exceptions and different ways of doing things. Now, another thing we have to be concerned about with refrigerating equipment is access by unqualified people. So we got to make sure that there's some kind of interlock. For instance, when this handle is in the up position, you know, I can't open the door. Also, I'd put a lock on it, be able to put a lock on, which I could right here, and prevent anybody from opening the door while the equipment is running, while the disconnect is energized. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I say that, right? Let's go ahead and shut the power off. We open up. Remember, top is always hot, right? I still have incoming power to the top of these stabs. And even though I pulled the blades out, I still have 208 or 480, whatever it is, coming into the top of this disconnect. So even though my fuses are de-energized, you know, Article 240 also tells you for cartridge type fuses and any fuses that operate at greater than 150 volts to ground, it says I have to have a disconnect switch on the line side of the fuses so that I can shut the power off to the fuses and remove the fuses. All of these rules for the location of the disconnecting means and the reasons why we have to have them are based on safety, aren't they? Make sure I can put it into an electrically safe work condition and work on it. So let's take a look at a few more of these applications then for our disconnecting means. Let's see, rather than go through all 70 of them, right? 110.22 tells me, it says that my disconnect must be marked. And of course, we just use this one for training, so it's not. But my disconnect must be marked. It must be marked legibly and durably. So not with a black Sharpie or anything like that, right? And it's got to be marked as to what its purpose is. As to, you know, this provides, might put CW number 3 up here, chill water pump number 3 or something like that, whatever it supplies. Also, and other than 1 and 2 family dwellings, I also have to mark on the front of this disconnect where the power source is for this disconnect. So if I have problems here, I know where to go to shut off the power to my disconnecting means. 110.25 says it has to be lockable in the open position. And so that's true. Once I open my disconnect, I can put a lock through here and lock it open. And of course, you think of lockout, tagout, don't you? In fact, that relates to a lot of the rules we see for motors in Article 430 for the location of disconnect. So that's another important one. Let's take a look at Article 430, Part 9. Part 9 says that I have to have a disconnecting means capable of disconnecting motors and controllers from the circuit. So let's go take a look at 430.102 and see what the code has to say about disconnecting means for motors. In my code book, that's page 356 in the 2023 code. 430.102 is divided into two sections. Subsection A is for motor controls and subsection B is for the motor itself. So the general rule is I have to have an individual disconnecting means for the motor controller. Also, subsection B, which talks about the motor, then tells me I have to have a disconnecting means for the motor. So that's two disconnects, except really if I read through here, I find out I can kill two birds with one stone. I'm allowed to use one disconnecting means in certain applications for those for both the motor controller and the motor disconnect. I also find out that as far as location is concerned, what's important is that my equipment be within sight of this disconnecting means, whatever type it is, whether it's this safety switch once again, or whether I have a molded case circuit breaker, which this instantaneous breaker motor circuit protector, it can be located inside of an MCC bucket. In fact, that's where this one's came from. I've got to be within sight of that. In other words, within 50 feet and visible. However, there are exceptions to that rule, and you want to read that. Okay. Another thing that we'll run into on disconnecting means, let's say that I have, I've got a control panel. So I've got a big control panel, let's say in an automation line of some kind, maybe a conveyor system with all kinds of automation equipment surrounding, picking and placing things off the conveyor or whatnot. Down at one end of the conveyor system, maybe I have a great big tall, 7-foot tall, 6-foot wide control cabinet or something like that. Inside of there, I'll find a PLC, variable speed drive. I'll find all kinds of relays and so forth. So I've probably got maybe 480 volts coming into that cabinet. So right on the front of that cabinet, I'll have a disconnect switch, except that disconnect is usually red and it's rotary type. And so I just turn that switch and I can de-energize that entire system. And so I have a disconnecting means there. However, let's say that I don't want to do that. Let's say that I have some equipment, motors and whatnot along that conveyor system, and I just want to work on that motor way down at the end, do something there, whatever. I don't want to shut down the whole system. So maybe I'll go ahead and I'll put another rotary type disconnect switch in some enclosure closer to where that motor is, with inside of that motor, so I can go ahead and just de-energize that one motor and not the others. So I can do that. Now, the term you're going to hear on those rotary type disconnect switches is UL 508 or UL 98. You see, they're both evaluated under different UL standards then. So for instance, the UL 98 switch, the UL 98 disconnect safety switch, when I operate that one back at the big control panel, I de-energize everything. So that's for branch circuit protection is what that's given me. Now down closer to the motor, maybe I want another switch that's also going to be marked. It's going to be suitable for use as a motor controller, because I could use it to start and stop a motor if I needed to. And so that's going to be evaluated according to the UL 508 standard. So anyway, very brief explanation, but you'll hear the terms if you work with industrial machinery, automation systems, UL 98 and UL 508 switches. You got to make sure you got the right one in the right location then, righty? Also, that brings up something else. We also have the NFPA 79 standard. The NFPA 79 standard is the electrical standard for industrial machinery. Chapter 5, all of Chapter 5 in this book is dedicated to disconnecting means for industrial equipment. And Cottam, without going through all of that chapter, certainly, But the bottom line is there was when we throw that one disconnect handle, we want to make sure that we de-energize not just the motors and it's themselves, but we also de-energize the control circuits, anything that is powered inside of that control cabinet then. So that's kind of the general rule on that, but a lot of other requirements for disconnects means on industrial machinery then. One last thing that we can go ahead and mention then is maintenance. The NFPA 70B is no longer the recommended practice for electrical equipment maintenance. It is now the standard for electrical equipment maintenance. So that means the maintenance that we do on our disconnecting means and safety switches and whatever we're using, UL 508s out there, whatever, it says we have to do maintenance on them. How often we do maintenance? Well, we'll find that in the NFPA 70B standard. What types of maintenance do we have to do? Well, it divides it up as to whether or not the equipment is operating and so forth, but kind of basically when it comes to disconnecting means, there's some different things you need to look at then. Okay, so you have to make sure everything operates properly. You go inside, you may have to go ahead and clean some stabs and contacts and whatnot. Make sure that all the parts are secure, the terminations secure and so forth. Some pretty standard cleaning, lubrication, whether you use a non-conductive or conductive lubricant on certain parts and so on. Testing, as far as electrical testing, you may have to test contact resistance and test for ground faults and things like that, insulation resistance testing. On these disconnecting switches, not so much, okay? Safety switch like this. But think of other types of switches that are covered in the code as well. How about an automatic transfer switch? Oh, yeah, boy, there's a lot of testing that has to be done there. A lot of electrical testing, infrared thermography. Once again, contact resistance, maybe low resistance ohm meters and things like that, all used on that particular switch. So anyway, it doesn't matter whether you're working on agricultural buildings, we mentioned, all the way to swimming pools and x-ray equipment. If you are involved in providing that disconnecting means or maintaining that disconnecting means, you need to take a look at the installation requirements in the National Electrical Code. You need to look at the requirements in NFPA 79 for industrial machinery, and especially NFPA 70B now for maintenance of that equipment. Because the main thing is what? That you go out of here and you work safely, right? So that's all the time we have today for our Tech Talk. This how-to video, EC&M Tech Talk, then, is brought to you by EC&M Magazine, which is part of the portfolio of Endeavor Business Publications. So the main thing, like I said, follow your code, read all your requirements, interpret them properly, and work safe out there.